Crying, Louisiana, 1832. A black pastor stood before his church altar at 3 a.m. listening, music to the breathing of 59 people hiding beneath his feet. He knew what awaited him if discovered. The noose, the whip, the slow parade of death reserved music for those who defied the system. Reverend Elijah Carter had been harboring runaway slaves under the wooden floor of his Baptist church for 5 months. The space was shallow. The air was thin, and every Sunday, music-white overseers sat in the back pews during service watching. One cry, one cough, one wrong move, and everyone dies. But Elijah had a plan to move them north in waves of 3, using swamp roots and unmarked graves as waypoints. Then on the night of August 2nd, a baby cried. Reverend Elijah Carter was 42 years old, born free in Mobile, Alabama, and settled in Music, East Feliciana Parish, Louisiana, where freedom meant almost nothing. He was a black man who could read, write, and preach, but he could music, not walk alone after dark without written permission. He could not gather more than 5 people without a white observer present. He could not look a white man in the eye without risking a beating. His weakness was not fear, it was faith. He believed God required action, not prayer alone. His church was a wooden structure with a leaking roof and dirt paths leading to the front door. It sat at the edge of a cotton field where men and women worked from sunrise to sunset under the gaze of overseers with whips and rifles. The church served as the only refuge for enslaved blacks in the area. They came on Sunday nights when the work was done. They sang quietly. They prayed with closed eyes, music, and they left before dawn. But beneath the sanctuary floor in a crawl space 85 centimeters high, 59 music people lived in darkness. They had run from 4 plantations. They had crossed rivers and swamps. They had left children behind, mothers behind, pieces of themselves behind. And now they waited for Elijah to save them. The stakes were absolute. Discovery meant death for Elijah and recapture for the others. Recapture meant torture, branding, and public execution as a warning to anyone else who dreamed of freedom. The plantation owners in East Feliciana Parish did not forgive. They did not show mercy. They made examples. Elijah's plan was simple. Every 5 days, he would guide 3 people north through the Atchafalaya swamps, past the Protestant cemeteries where runaways hid among the tombstones toward the free territory of Missouri. It would take months. It would require silence, discipline, and luck, but it was the only way. Then the baby cried. Elijah Carter had not planned to become a conductor on any underground route. He had not asked for this burden. It found him the way truth always finds those who refuse to look away. The first refugee arrived on a February night. Her name was Dinah. She was 19 years old, pregnant, and bleeding from a gash above her left eye. She had walked 12 miles barefoot through frozen mud after her owner at Belle Plantation tried to sell her unborn child in advance to a broker from Natchez. Dinah knocked on the church door just after midnight. Elijah opened it without hesitation. He hid her in the storage room behind the pulpit for 3 days. She ate cornbread and drank rainwater collected in tin cups. On the 4th day, Elijah asked her where she planned to go. She said she did not know. She said she would rather die than go back. Elijah nodded. He had heard those words before. That same week, 2 men arrived, brothers. They had run from a plantation near Clinton after their younger sister was whipped to death for breaking a water jug. The overseer had hung her body from a sycamore tree and left it there for 2 days as a lesson. The brothers came to Elijah because they had heard whispers in the fields. They had heard that the black pastor with the crooked church was different, that he did not bow, that he did not turn people away. Elijah did not turn them away. By March, there were 9 people hiding in the church. By April, 22. By June, 41. They came in pairs, in groups, alone. They came with torn clothes and swollen feet. They came with scars shaped like letters burned into their backs. They came because they had nowhere else to go. Elijah realized the storage room was no longer enough. The church had no cellar. It had no attic. It had only a crawl space beneath the floorboards, a narrow gap between the wooden planks and the dirt foundation. The space was meant for drainage and ventilation. It was not meant for people, but Elijah made it work. He pried up the floorboards in the center of the sanctuary where the pews cast the deepest shadows. He reinforced the foundation with cypress beams stolen from a nearby construction site. He dug the dirt floor lower, carving out an additional 6 inches of headroom. The final space measured 85 centimeters from floor to ceiling. It was long and narrow, stretching from the altar to the back wall. It could fit 60 people if they lay shoulder to shoulder and did not move. The entrance was hidden beneath a section of flooring near the pulpit. Elijah covered the seams with a worn rug. He placed a wooden bench on top. No one would think to look there. No one would think a pastor would risk his life for runaways. The rules were absolute. No noise during the day, no movement during Sunday services, no light, no fire, no talking above a whisper. Anyone who broke the rules endangered everyone else. Elijah made this clear. The refugees understood. Every night at 3 a.m., Elijah brought food and water. He lowered buckets through the hidden entrance. Bread, dried meat, cornmeal mixed with lard. It was not enough to stop hunger, but it was enough to keep them alive. He also brought news. He told them which roads were being watched. He told them which plantations had increased patrols. He told them when it was safe to move. But moving 60 people was impossible. The swamps were patrolled. The roads were watched. The bloodhounds could track a scent for 15 miles. Elijah knew he could not move them all at once. He had to move them in small groups slowly, carefully over weeks or months. He began planning the route. The first leg would take them west through the Atchafalaya Basin, a maze of swamps and bayous where even experienced hunters got lost. The second leg would take them north along the Mississippi River, staying close to the water to mask their scent. The third leg would take them through unmarked trails used by trappers and smugglers past Protestant cemeteries where sympathetic gravediggers left food and supplies in empty tombs. The final leg would take them into Missouri, a free state where slavery was illegal and bounty hunters had no jurisdiction. It was a 500-mile journey. It would take 40 days on foot, and it assumed nothing went wrong. Elijah chose 3 people for the first group. A young man named Abel, 23 years old, strong and silent. A woman named Clarara, 31, who had survived 2 escape attempts before. And an older man named Moses, 56, who had once been a blacksmith and knew how to make tools from scrap metal. Elijah believed they had the best chance of surviving the journey. He prepared them for 3 weeks. He taught them how to navigate by the stars. He taught them which plants were safe to eat and which would kill them. He taught them how to stay still when dogs approached, how to breathe shallow, how to become invisible. He gave them a hand-drawn map with landmarks only a local would recognize, a fallen oak shaped like a cross, a creek that ran backward during high tide, a burned-out cabin with a stone chimney. On the night of March 18th, Elijah led the 3 of them out of the church and into the woods. They walked for 6 hours without speaking. At dawn, they reached the edge of the Atchafalaya Basin. Elijah gave them each a piece of bread, a small knife, and a blessing. Then he turned back. The 3 refugees disappeared into the swamp. Elijah did not know if they survived. He would not know for weeks, but he had to keep moving. He had 56 people left. 2 weeks later, he prepared the second group, 3 more people, a mother, and her 2 teenage sons. They had run from a plantation near Jackson after the overseer tried to sell the boys separately. The mother refused to let them be separated. She cut the overseer's face with a kitchen knife and ran. Elijah sent them north on April 3rd. By May, he had sent 4 groups, 12 people total. He had heard no word from any of them. He did not know if they had reached Missouri. He did not know if they were alive. He only knew that the space beneath the church floor was still crowded, still suffocating, still dangerous, and the danger was growing. White overseers had noticed the increased foot traffic around the church. They had noticed that certain slaves were disappearing from nearby plantations. They had noticed that Elijah Carter's church seemed to attract more visitors than usual, even on weeknights. Suspicion spread like smoke. In mid-May, 2 white men attended Sunday service. They sat in the back row and watched Elijah preach. They did not sing, they did not pray. They just watched. Beneath the floorboards, 44 people held their breath. A baby born 3 weeks earlier in the crawl space lay silent in his mother's arms. The mother pressed her hand gently over the baby's mouth, ready to muffle any sound. The service lasted 90 minutes. Elijah preached about Moses leading the Israelites out of Egypt. He preached about Pharaoh's army drowning in the Red Sea. He preached about freedom as a divine right, not a privilege granted by men. The 2 white men exchanged glances. One of them wrote something in a small notebook. After the service ended, the white men approached Elijah. One of them smiled. He said he enjoyed the sermon. He said it was inspiring. He asked Elijah where he had learned to read. Elijah said his father had taught him. The man nodded. He asked if Elijah knew anything about the missing slaves from Belle Reve Plantation. Elijah said he did not. The man smiled again. He said he hoped that was true. Then he left. Elijah knew what that visit meant. He knew they were watching him now. He knew they suspected something. He knew time was running out. That night, he gathered the refugees beneath the floor. He spoke to them in a whisper. He told them the plan had to accelerate. He told them he would send out larger groups, 5 or 6 at a time, even though it increased the risk of detection. He told them some of them might not make it. He told them the choice was theirs. No one chose to stay. Over the next 6 weeks, Elijah sent out 5 more groups, 30 people total. He moved them at night through rain and fog, using every trick he had learned. He bribed a ferryman to take them across the Mississippi. He paid a gravedigger to hide them in a mausoleum for 3 days. He traded his only horse to a trapper in exchange for safe passage through a stretch of wilderness controlled by slave catchers. By the end of June, only 14 people remained beneath the church floor. Elijah felt a flicker of hope. He thought he might actually save them all. He thought he might pull off the impossible. Then the baby started crying. It was August 2nd, just after midnight. Elijah was kneeling at the altar, praying silently when he heard it, a soft, muffled cry rising from beneath the floorboards. He froze. The cry grew louder. He heard the mother trying to soothe the child, but the baby would not stop. Elijah knew what would happen next. He knew the sound would carry. He knew the dogs would hear it. He knew the hunters would come. He was right. Within an hour, torches appeared in the distance. Bloodhounds howled. Men shouted. Elijah stood at the front door of the church and watched them approach. He did not run. He did not hide. He stepped outside and waited. The slave catchers arrived with guns, whips, and dogs. There were 8 of them, all white, all armed. Their leader was a man named Garrett Sims, a professional bounty hunter known for his cruelty. He had caught over 200 runaways in his career. He never brought them back alive if he could avoid it. Dead slaves were easier to transport. Sims walked up to Elijah and smiled. He said he had heard interesting things about this church. He said he had heard it was a place of miracles. He asked Elijah if he believed in miracles. Elijah said nothing. Sims gestured to his men. They entered the church and began tearing up the floorboards. It took them less than 10 minutes to find the hidden entrance. They pulled up the rug, moved the bench, and pried open the trap door. Torchlight flooded the crawlspace below. 14 people stared up at them. Men, women, children. Their eyes wide, their faces covered in dirt, their bodies pressed together in the darkness. Sims laughed. He said it was the biggest catch he had ever made. He said Elijah had just earned himself a hanging. The refugees were dragged out one by one. They were chained together at the wrists and ankles. The dogs circled them, snarling. One of the men tried to run. A hunter shot him in the leg. He fell and screamed. No one helped him. Elijah was bound with rope and thrown into the back of a wagon. He did not resist. He did not speak. He watched as the refugees were led away in chains. He watched as the church door was left open, swinging in the wind. He watched as everything he had built collapsed in a single night. 3 days later, Elijah Carter was hanged from a fig tree near the cotton fields of Belle Reve Plantation. A crowd of over 300 people gathered to watch. Plantation owners, overseers, enslaved workers forced to attend as a warning. Elijah stood on the platform with his hands tied behind his back. The noose was placed around his neck. A pastor from a white church read a passage from the Bible about obedience to earthly masters. Elijah did not lower his head. He did not beg. He looked out at the crowd and said 7 words. 50 already made it. You're too late. Then the platform dropped. His body was left hanging for 24 hours. No one was allowed to cut it down. No one was allowed to mourn. It swayed in the August heat, a warning to anyone who dared to dream of freedom. But Elijah Carter had told the truth. 50 people had already escaped, and they were not done running. The 14 refugees pulled from beneath the church floor were separated immediately. The men were chained in one wagon, the women and children in another. They were not allowed to speak. They were not allowed to look at each other. The slave catchers drove them through the night back toward the plantations they had fled from months earlier. But 4 of them never made it back. During the transport, a woman named Ruth jumped from the moving wagon. She hit the ground hard and rolled into a ditch. 2 hunters went after her with dogs. They found her 3 hours later hiding in a hollow log. She fought them. She clawed at their faces. She bit one of them on the arm. They beat her with rifle butts until she stopped moving. Then they dragged her body back to the wagon and threw it in with the others. She died before sunrise. A man named Joshua tried to slip his chains during a rest stop. He had thin wrists and had been slowly working the iron cuffs loose for hours. He almost succeeded, but a hunter noticed. They stripped him naked, tied him to a tree, and whipped him 30 times in front of the others. Then they poured salt into the wounds. Joshua screamed until his voice gave out. He died 2 days later from infection. 2 children, a brother and sister aged 9 and 11, were sold to a trader from New Orleans before they even reached their original plantation. The trader paid cash on the spot. The children cried and reached for their mother, but she was chained in the other wagon. She screamed their names until her throat bled. She never saw them again. The remaining 10 refugees were returned to their plantations. They were branded with the letter R on their foreheads. R for runaway. The brand was applied with a hot iron heated in a fire until it glowed orange. The process took 5 seconds per person. The smell of burning flesh hung in the air for hours afterward. 3 of them were assigned to work in the fields with iron collars around their necks. The collars had long metal prongs extending outward in all directions, making it impossible to lie down or rest. They wore the collars for 6 months. 1 man died from exhaustion after 3 weeks. Another lost his mind and stopped speaking entirely. The others were locked in a shed with no windows and fed once a day. They were kept there for 2 months as punishment. When they were finally released, 2 of them could no longer walk properly. Their legs had atrophied from lack of movement, but the worst punishment was reserved for the mother whose baby had cried that night. Her name was Sarah. She was 24 years old. She had given birth in the crawl space beneath the church on July 10th, 3 weeks before the raid. The baby was a boy. She had named him Elijah after the pastor who had saved her. When the slave catchers found her, they ripped the baby from her arms. She begged them not to hurt him. She begged them to let her keep him. They laughed. One of them held the baby by his feet and dangled him in front of her face. Then he walked to the church well and dropped the baby in. Sarah screamed. She lunged forward, but the chains held her back. The hunters watched the well for a moment, then turned away. The baby's cries echoed from the darkness below, growing fainter and fainter until they stopped. Sarah was taken back to Belle Rive Plantation, branded and assigned to work in the sugar mill. The sugar mill was the worst job on any plantation. The machines crushed cane stalks between massive iron rollers. Workers fed the stalks into the rollers by hand. If a hand got caught, the entire arm would be pulled in. There was no way to stop the machine quickly. The standard procedure was to chop off the arm with an axe before the body was dragged through. Sarah lasted 3 months. On November 4th, her left hand slipped. The rollers caught her fingers. She tried to pull back, but the machine was too strong. Her arm was pulled in up to the elbow. The overseer grabbed an axe. He swung twice. Sarah's arm came off just below the shoulder. She bled to death on the mill floor within minutes. Her body was buried in an unmarked grave behind the slave quarters. No one said a prayer. No one marked the spot. Within a week, the grass grew over it, and no one remembered where she had been laid to rest. The other survivors carried these stories with them. They whispered them in the fields. They whispered them in the quarters. They whispered them in the dark. The stories spread from plantation to plantation, from parish to parish, from Louisiana to Mississippi to Alabama. Everyone heard what happened to Reverend Elijah Carter. Everyone heard what happened to the people he tried to save. And the message was clear. This is what happens when you run. This is what happens when you resist. This is what happens when you believe freedom is possible. For months, the number of escape attempts in East Feliciana Parish dropped to 0. No one ran. No one hid. No one even whispered about freedom. The terror had worked, but 50 people were still out there. 50 people who had escaped before the raid. 50 people who were still running. And one of them was about to change everything. His name was Abel. He was 23 years old, the first refugee Elijah had sent north on March 18th. He had traveled with Clara and Moses, the 2 others in that initial group. They had made it through the Atchafalaya Basin in 9 days. They had crossed the Mississippi River on a stolen canoe. They had navigated by the stars, eating wild berries and raw fish, sleeping in trees to avoid the dogs. On the 14th day, they reached a Protestant cemetery near the town of Vidalia. The gravedigger, a free black man named Thomas, had been paid by Elijah to help refugees. He hid them in a stone morale for 3 days, brought them food, and gave them directions to the next safe point. But Moses never made it. On the 17th day, while crossing a creek, he slipped on a rock and broke his leg. The bone pierced the skin. Infection set in within hours. Clara Ara and Abel tried to carry him, but he was too heavy and the pain was too great. Moses told them to leave him. He told them he had lived long enough. He told them to finish what Reverend Carter had started. They left him by the creek with a knife and a piece of bread. When they looked back, he was sitting against a tree, staring at the sky. They never saw him again. Clara Ara and Abel continued north. They walked for 23 more days through forests and swamps, past towns and plantations, always moving, always watching. On April 29th, they crossed into Missouri. They stood on free soil for the first time in their lives. Clara Ara fell to her knees and wept. Abel stood silent, staring at the horizon. He did not feel relief. He did not feel joy. He felt rage because he knew what was happening back in Louisiana. He knew Reverend Carter was still hiding people. He knew more refugees were coming. He knew the slave catchers were getting closer, and he knew that if he did nothing, everyone would die. So Abel made a choice. Instead of disappearing into freedom, instead of starting a new life, instead of forgetting the past, he turned around and went back. Clara Ara begged him not to. She told him he would be caught. She told him he would be killed. She told him freedom was too precious to throw away. But Abel did not listen. He said freedom meant nothing if others were still in chains. He said Reverend Carter had given him life and he owed a debt. He said he was going back to finish the job. Clara Ara watched him walk south, back toward Louisiana, back toward the plantations, back toward the dogs and the chains and the whips. She never saw him again either. But Abel did not go back to East Feliciana Parish. He knew the church had been compromised. He knew Elijah had been arrested. He knew the hunters were watching every road, every river, every hiding place. So he went somewhere else. He went to the swamps. The Atchafalaya Basin was a maze of waterways, islands, and forests stretching over 1 million acres. It was a place where fugitives had hidden for generations. Runaways built camps deep in the swamp, far from roads and towns where no white man dared to go. They fished, hunted, and survived in isolation. Some had been there for years, some had been there for decades. Abel found one of these camps on May 12th. It was a cluster of crude shelters built on a raised island hidden behind a wall of cypress trees and hanging moss. 37 people lived there, men, women, and children, all of them runaways. All of them waiting for a chance to move north. Abel told them about Reverend Carter. He told them about the church, the crawl space, the 50 people who had escaped. He told them about the raid, the hanging, the torture. He told them that more people were still out there, scattered across Louisiana, hiding in barns and attics and ditches, waiting for someone to show them the way. He told them he was going to find every single one of them and lead them to freedom. The people in the camp laughed. They said it was impossible. They said the hunters controlled the roads. They said the dogs could track a scent through water. They said Abel would be caught within a week. Abel said he did not care. He said he would go alone if he had to, but he did not have to go alone. 3 men volunteered to go with him. A trapper named Silas, who knew every trail and waterway in southern Louisiana. A woman named Grace, who had escaped from Belle Reve Plantation 2 years earlier and knew where the hunters patrolled. And a teenager named Daniel who could run faster than anyone in the camp and had a memory for faces. The 4 of them left the camp on May 15th. They traveled at night, moving through the swamps and forests, avoiding roads and towns, searching for refugees. They found the first group on May 18th, 6 people hiding in an abandoned barn near Baton Rouge. Abel told them about the route through the swamps. He drew them a map in the dirt. He told them to wait 3 days, then follow the map to the camp. They found the second group on May 22nd. 4 people hiding in a tobacco shed near St. Francisville. Same instructions, same map, same 3-day wait. They found the third group on May 27th. 2 teenage boys hiding in a chicken coop. They had been there for 2 weeks eating raw eggs and drinking rainwater. They were weak and starving. Abel carried them both on his back to the swamp camp. Over the next 6 weeks, Abel and his team found 23 refugees scattered across East Feliciana, West Feliciana, and East Baton Rouge parishes. They brought them all to the swamp camp. By the end of June, the camp held 60 people. Too many to stay hidden, too many to feed, too many to move all at once. Abel knew they had to leave. He knew the hunters would eventually find the camp. He knew that if they stayed, everyone would be caught. So he made a new plan. He would move them in one large group, all 60 people at once. They would travel at night through the swamps, staying off the roads, moving fast and silent. They would cross the Mississippi River in stolen boats. They would navigate through hostile territory using nothing but stars and instinct, and they would not stop until they reached Missouri. It was a 41-day journey. The distance was over 500 meters. The risks were infinite. But Abel believed it was the only way. He spent 2 weeks preparing. He gathered supplies. He scouted routes. He memorized landmarks. He trained the refugees on how to move quietly, how to avoid detection, how to survive on almost nothing. He told them that some of them would not make it. He told them that some of them would die along the way. He told them the choice was theirs. Every single person chose to go. On July 10th, exactly 1 month before the raid on Reverend Carter's church, Abel led 60 people out of the swamp camp and into the darkness. They walked in a single-file line, silent and invisible, through forests and fields, past sleeping towns and patrolled roads. They crossed creeks by forming human chains, the strong carrying the weak. They hid during the day in caves, ditches, and thicket. They ate wild plants and drank from streams. On the 5th day, a hunter spotted them near the town of Woodville, Mississippi. He fired a shot. The group scattered into the forest. 2 people were hit. 1 died instantly. The other, a woman named Abigail, was shot in the stomach. She bled for hours. Abel stayed with her until she stopped breathing. Then he buried her under a pile of leaves and kept moving. On the 12th day, they reached the Mississippi River. Abel stole 3 fishing boats from a dock in Natchez. They crossed in the middle of the night, paddling silently, praying the current would not sweep them downstream. 1 boat capsized. 4 people drowned. The others made it across. On the 19th day, they ran out of food. They ate tree bark, roots, insects. A child named Emma, only 6 years old, collapsed from hunger. Her mother carried her for 3 days until her own strength gave out. Then Abel carried them both. On the 27th day, bloodhounds picked up their trail. The hunters came at dawn. Abel heard the dogs barking in the distance. He told the group to split up. He told them to run in different directions. He told them to meet at a landmark he had described, a burned cabin with a stone chimney 3 miles north. 32 people made it to the cabin. 28 did not. Some were caught. Some got lost. Some simply gave up. But Abel did not stop. He kept moving. He kept leading. He kept believing that freedom was possible. On the 39th day, they crossed into Missouri. 50 people remained. 50 people who had survived starvation, drowning, gunfire, and pursuit. 50 people who had walked over 500 meters in 41 days. 50 people who were finally free. Abel stood at the border and looked back toward Louisiana. He thought about Reverend Elijah Carter. He thought about the church, the crawl space, the 59 people who had hidden beneath the floor. He thought about the ones who had died. He thought about the ones who were still suffering. And he made a promise. He promised that their sacrifice would not be forgotten. He promised that their story would be told. He promised that one day the world would know what they had endured. But Abel did not know the full story yet. He did not know that on August 2nd, just 2 days after he led his group into Missouri, Reverend Carter's church had been raided. He did not know that 14 people had been captured. He did not know that Elijah had been hanged. He did not know that the baby had been dropped into the well. He would not learn these details for another 6 months. And when he did, he would weep for 3 days without stopping. But in that moment, standing on free soil, surrounded by people who had survived the impossible, Abel felt something he had not felt in years. He felt hope. Abel learned the truth. On February 14, 1833, 6 months after leading 50 people to freedom in Missouri, a free black man named Samuel arrived at the settlement where Abel and the other refugees had built new lives. Samuel was a traveling preacher who moved between free states and slave states carrying messages and news. He had come from Louisiana with a story that needed to be told. Samuel gathered everyone in the settlement, over 100 people now, refugees from different plantations, different states, different journeys. They sat in a circle in the center of the small town they had built. Abel sat in front. Samuel looked at him directly and spoke. He told them about the raid on August 2nd. He told them about the baby crying. He told them about the slave catchers breaking through the church door. He told them about the 14 people dragged from beneath the floor. He told them about Reverend Elijah Carter standing on the platform with a noose around his neck saying his final words. 50 already made it. You're too late. Samuel told them about the fig tree. He told them about the body hanging for 24 hours. He told them about the whipping, the brandings, the mutilations. He told them about Ruth, Joshua, and the 2 children sold to the trader. He told them about Sarah and her baby dropped into the well. He told them about the sugar mill and the severed arm. He told them everything. When Samuel finished speaking, no one moved. No one made a sound. Abel sat with his head in his hands. Tears fell between his fingers and landed in the dirt. A woman named Grace, who had helped him find the hidden refugees, began to wail. Others joined her. The sound rose into the air like a prayer or a scream or both at once. Abel cried for 3 days. He did not eat. He did not sleep. He sat alone in a small cabin and stared at the wall. He thought about Reverend Carter preparing him for the journey north. He thought about the hand-drawn map, the whispered instructions, the blessing before dawn. He thought about the man who had risked everything to save people he did not know, and he thought about the 50 people around him who were alive because of that risk. On the 4th day, Abel stopped crying. He stood up. He walked to the center of the settlement and called everyone together. He told them they had a responsibility. He told them they could not let the story die. He told them they had to make sure the world knew what Reverend Elijah Carter had done. But Abel also knew something else. He knew the story could not end with grief. He knew it could not end with death and suffering. He knew that if the only thing people remembered was the horror, then the slave owners had won. So Abel decided to do something no one expected. He decided to go back to Louisiana one more time. The others thought he had lost his mind. They told him he would be recognized. They told him he would be caught and killed. They told him that going back was suicide. But Abel did not care. He said there was something he needed to do. He said he owed Reverend Carter a debt that could never be repaid, but he could at least try. Abel left Missouri on March 1st, 1833. He traveled alone. He dyed his skin darker using walnut oil to change his appearance. He shaved his head. He wore different clothes. He walked with a limp to disguise his gait. He carried forged papers claiming he was a free man named Joseph Grant from Tennessee. He reached East Feliciana Parish on March 19th, exactly 1 year after Reverend Carter had first sent him north. He traveled at night and hid during the day. He avoided roads and towns. He stayed in the swamps and forests where no one would see him. On March 21st, Abel reached the church. It was abandoned. The door hung crooked on broken hinges. The windows were shattered. The roof had collapsed in 2 places. Weeds grew through cracks in the wooden floor. The pews were gone. The altar was gone. Everything was gone, but the floor was still there. The floorboards that had hidden 59 people, the trappo that had led to the crawl space, the space where people had lived in darkness for 5 months, breathing shallow, praying silent, waiting for freedom. Abel knelt on the floor and ran his hands over the wood. He could feel the seams where the boards had been pried up and nailed back down. He could see the worn edges where people had climbed in and out. He could almost hear the whispers, the breathing, the muffled prayers. He stayed there for an hour. Then he stood up and walked outside. Behind the church, Abel found the fig tree, the tree where Reverend Carter had been hanged. The rope was gone, but the branch was still there, a thick horizontal limb extending out from the trunk like an accusing finger. The bark was scarred where the rope had worn into the wood. Abel stood beneath the tree and looked up. He thought about the crowd of 300 people watching. He thought about the white pastor reading from the Bible about obedience. He thought about Elijah's final words, and then Abel did something that would change everything. He carved a message into the tree. He used a knife he had brought from Missouri. He carved slowly and carefully, making sure every letter was clear and deep. The message took him 2 hours to complete. When he finished, he stepped back and read the words aloud. Here stood a man who chose heaven over earth. 59 souls passed through his hands. 50 lived free. His name was Elijah Carter. Remember, Abel knew the message would not last long. He knew the plantation owners would find it and cut it down. He knew they would try to erase Reverend Carter from history. But he also knew that some things could not be erased. He knew that stories survived even when monuments did not. He knew that truth had a way of living on. Before leaving, Abel did one more thing. He walked to the well where Sarah's baby had been dropped. The well had been sealed with wooden planks and dirt. No one used it anymore. Abel removed the planks and looked down into the darkness. He could not see the bottom. He whispered a prayer. He did not know the right words, so he made them up. He prayed for the baby who never got a name. He prayed for Sarah who died in the sugar mill. He prayed for Ruth, Joshua, Moses, and all the others who did not make it. He prayed for Reverend Carter and his 59 refugees. He prayed for the living and the dead. Then he replaced the planks and left. Abel walked away from the church, away from the plantation, away from Louisiana. He walked north for 38 days until he crossed back into Missouri. He returned to the settlement on April 28th. The others greeted him with shock and relief. They thought they would never see him again. Abel told them what he had done. He told them about the message carved into the tree. He told them about the prayer at the well. He told them that Reverend Carter's story would not be forgotten. And he was right. Over the next 20 years, Abel told the story to everyone he met. He told it to other refugees. He told it to abolitionists. He told it to journalists and preachers and politicians. He told it in churches and meeting halls and town squares. He told it in whispers and shouts and sermons. The story spread. It moved from Missouri to Illinois to Ohio to Pennsylvania. It crossed state lines and borders. It appeared in abolitionist newspapers. It was printed on pamphlets and broadsides. It was told in slave quarters and free communities. It became a legend, a symbol, a rallying cry. People began to understand what Reverend Elijah Carter had done. They understood that he had built a sanctuary in the heart of hell. They understood that he had risked everything for people he barely knew. They understood that he had died so others could live. And they understood something else. They understood that the fight for freedom required sacrifice. They understood that some people would have to pay with their lives. They understood that the cost of justice was always higher than anyone wanted to admit. But they also understood that it was worth it. The story of Reverend Carter inspired hundreds of others to take action. Free blacks and sympathetic whites began creating networks of safe houses across the South. They hid refugees in attics and cellars and barns. They guided them through swamps and mountains. They forged papers and bribed officials. They broke laws and risked imprisonment and death. The Underground Railroad grew stronger because of stories like Elijah Carter's. It grew bolder, it grew more organized, and it saved thousands of lives. Abel never stopped telling the story. Even as he grew older, even as his memory faded, even as his body weakened, he continued to speak. He lived to see the end of slavery. He lived to see the Emancipation Proclamation signed on January 1st, 1863. He lived to see the 13th Amendment ratified on December 6, 1865. Abel died on March 18, 1872, exactly 40 years after Reverend Carter first sent him north. He was 63 years old. His final words were the same words he had spoken for 4 decades. 50 made it. Remember, the church where Reverend Elijah Carter hid 59 refugees was eventually torn down. The plantation owners burned it in 1835 to erase any trace of what had happened there. The fig tree was cut down in 1838. The well was filled with stones and dirt. The land was plowed and replanted. Everything was erased. But the story survived. In 1921, a group of black activists in Louisiana purchased the land where the church once stood. They rebuilt the church using the original foundation. They laid new floorboards over the crawl space. They installed new pews and a new altar. They hung a bronze plaque above the door. The plaque read, "Here, the ground held the sky for those who already lived in hell." The church still stands today. It is a small wooden building with a leaking roof and dirt paths leading to the front door. It looks exactly like it did in 1832. Visitors come from all over the country to see it. They stand in the sanctuary and imagine 59 people lying beneath their feet. They walk outside and look for the fig tree that is no longer there. They read the plaque and try to understand what it means. Some visitors ask to see the crawl space. The church allows this once a month. A section of the floor near the altar is removed and people are invited to climb down into the darkness. The space is still only 85 centimeters high. It is still long and narrow. It is still suffocating. Most people can only stay down there for a few minutes before they need to come back up. They emerge gasping for air, their eyes wide, their faces pale. They say they cannot imagine living there for 5 months. They say they cannot imagine breathing in that darkness. They say they cannot imagine the fear. But 59 people did imagine it. And they survived it, and 50 of them walked away free. The story of Reverend Elijah Carter is not a story about death. It is not a story about suffering. It is not a story about defeat. It is a story about what people will risk when they believe freedom is possible. It is a story about the cost of courage. It is a story about the price of standing up when everyone else is kneeling down. Elijah Carter could have turned away the first refugee. He could have told Diner to find somewhere else to hide. He could have said the risk was too great. He could have chosen safety over sacrifice. But he did not. He opened the door. He pulled up the floorboards. He dug the earth with his own hands. He fed them bread and water in the middle of the night. He planned routes and drew maps and whispered instructions. He sent them north in groups of 3, knowing some would not make it. He kept going even when the hunters started watching. He kept going even when the danger grew unbearable. He kept going because he believed one life saved was worth one life given. And he was right. 50 people lived because Elijah Carter died. 50 people had children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. 50 people built lives in freedom. 50 people proved that resistance was possible, that escape was possible, that a different future was possible. The slave owners wanted to make an example of Elijah Carter. They wanted to show the world what happened to those who defied the system. They wanted to create fear so complete that no one would ever try again. But they failed because the story did not end with the hanging. It did not end with the torture and the branding and the mutilations. It did not end with the baby in the well, or the woman in the sugar mill, or the bodies left in the swamp. It ended with 50 people standing on free soil. It ended with Abel carving a message into a tree. It ended with a bronze plaque above a rebuilt church door. It ended with truth outlasting terror. The lesson is simple. The lesson is devastating. The lesson is this. Some things are worth dying for, and some things are worth living for. And sometimes those two things are the same. Reverend Elijah Carter understood this. He understood that freedom was not a gift. It was not a privilege. It was not something that could be granted or taken away by others. It was a right that had to be seized, defended, and paid for in blood and sacrifice. He understood that his life was not his own. It belonged to the 59 people beneath his floor. It belonged to the future they would build. It belonged to the story that would outlive them all, and in the end, that story became his monument. Not the church, not the tree, not the well, but the 50 lives that continued after his ended, the 50 voices that spoke his name, the 50 hearts that carried his memory. That was the real resurrection. That was the real victory. That was the real freedom. The bronze plaque above the church door says it best. Here the ground held the sky for those who already lived in hell. Elijah Carter was the ground solid, unmoving, bearing the weight of heaven and earth. And the 50 people who walked away free were the sky infinite, unbounded, rising towards something better, and that is the story. That is the truth. That is the price one man paid so 50 others could live. His name was Elijah Carter. He was 42 years old. He was a pastor, a guide, and a martyr. He hid 59 people beneath a church floor. He sent 50 of them to freedom. He died on a fig tree in August heat. And his story will never die. Remember,